Hello, everybody. My name is Mr. DeVito, and I am here today to present to you a little bit about conflict, which is really a major driving force in all works of literature. So, to start off, just to kind of talk about conflict generally, and then quite a bit more about how it works throughout literature, and then I will end with some examples from the Pearl. So, in works of narrative, conflict is the challenge main characters need to solve in order to achieve their goals. Traditionally, conflict is a major literary element of narrative or dramatic structure that creates challenges in a story by adding uncertainty to the goal that would be achieved by a character. And that uncertainty is what creates tension, which is essentially what drives the narrative. So narratives are not limited to single conflicts, which is evident in The Pearl. And while conflicts may not always resolve in a narrative, the resolution of a conflict creates closure or fulfillment when it does happen. But that may or may not always occur, and it depends on where in the story it occurs for how it contributes to the narrative. So conflict in literature refers to the different drives of the characters or forces involved. Conflict may be internal or external. That is, it may occur within a character's mind or between a character and exterior forces. It's most visible between two or more characters, usually a protagonist and antagonist, or a villain, an enemy, something like that. But it can occur in many different forms. A character may as easily find himself or herself in a conflict with a natural force, such as an animal or a weather event like a hurricane. The literary purpose of conflict is to create tension in the story, as I mentioned. So what that does is it makes readers more intrigued and more interested in the narrative and the plot because they're uncertain about what's going to happen between the characters and the forces. Now, there may be multiple points of conflict in a single story, which we recognize in The Pearl. Characters may have more than one desire or may struggle with more than one thing. So when a conflict is resolved and the reader discovers which force or character succeeds, it creates a sense of closure, should that happen. Now, conflicts may resolve at any point in a story, particularly when more than one conflict exists, but stories often don't resolve every conflict. If a story ends without resolving the main or major conflicts, it is said to have an open ending, which is pretty common in literature. Open endings can serve to essentially ask you to consider the conflict more personally, right? Because it brings your attention to how you may have responded or what you think that character should have done and what actually might happen once you've finished reading that story. So that's the gist of conflict. Now for the types of conflict and some examples from The Pearl. So first we have character versus self, and this is an internal struggle or an internal conflict. This is illustrated when, in the first chapter, Kino leaves to get the doctor's help to help Coyotito, who has been stung by a scorpion, and the venom is coursing through his little body. So Kino goes to the doctor, and when the doctor finds out that Kino doesn't have money to pay for the doctor's services and is turned away, Kino begins to feel the shame of being poor and unable to pay for his child's recovery. So this is a very initial sense of conflict that Kino experiences. So that is character versus self, right? It's Kino versus his own internal self. Next, we have character versus character. And this arises when Kino and Juana enter into conflict over what to do with the pearl. You recall that Kino wakes one night, and Juana has crept out of the hut, and she goes down to the water's edge to throw the pearl into the ocean. Kino is clearly not very happy about that. he wants to keep it in order to fulfill his desires for the material and immaterial, right? So the material desires that he has are for things like the rifle and new clothes, and the immaterial would be the wedding, right? It's not a tangible object, but it's an event. Next is character versus society. And I don't have, there's plenty of direct examples of this, but I thought that this excerpt would be a little more interesting to break up the approach that I've been using. So this is an excerpt from, I don't remember which chapter it is, but here's the excerpt. It is wonderful the way a little town keeps track of itself and of all its units. If every single man and woman, child and baby acts and conducts itself in a known pattern and breaks no walls and differs with no one and experiments in no way and is not sick and does not endanger the ease and peace of mind or steady unbroken flow of the town, then that unit can disappear and never be heard of. But let one man step out of the regular thought or the known and trusted pattern, and the nerves of the townspeople ring with nervousness, and communication travels over the nerve lines of the town. So what that to me illustrates is this idea that if a character or if a person is to deviate from the accepted cultural norms of a society, that the balance of that society is immediately disrupted, which would pit that character or that person against the society. So that is character versus society. We then have character versus nature, and this is an external conflict. This occurs in the very beginning of the Pearl, when the scorpion is slowly climbing down the rope that holds Coyotito's basket. And Kino and Juana have no control over what happens with that scorpion, and they attempt to prevent it from stinging Coyotito, but in vain. So nature cannot be controlled, and despite our attempts. So of course we know that that Coyotito is stung by the scorpion. And so now Coyotito's fate is sort of in the hands of the natural world. So that is character versus nature. The next conflict is character versus machine, which I struggled to find a really clear example of in this, in the first 5 chapters at least. So if any of you out there do have something or want to make an argument for this type of conflict, please do that, and we can open up a new discussion about it. That would be really cool. Typically, man versus machine or character versus machine would be, or a good example would be like mankind's desire to create robots to help us do things in a more efficient way and put like human life at less risk in certain contexts. And the tension and the uncertainty arises in what is at this point theoretical, but is very, very possible, which is artificial intelligence learning faster than we can, and machines taking over the world. So that would be an example of man versus machine. And then we have finally character versus fate or the supernatural. And I think there's a few examples of this in the Pearl, but the one that I want to mention to you is when Juana starts to attribute to the Pearl some supernatural forces. Like she says it's an evil thing and it's a sin and it will destroy them. And she becomes plagued by the idea that this Pearl is nothing but trouble, and her desire to get rid of the Pearl, well, that culminates in what happens on the beach between her and Kino. So that is character versus the supernatural. So these are just a few examples from the Pearl. There are, I counted, I think, 10 or 11 in the first 3 or 4 chapters, and I probably skipped some. So it might be a good idea for you to go back through some of those chapters and readdress or go back to those moments in the story where these conflicts arise, and to read around those again, and just to get a better handle on on conflict and how conflict does drive the plot. So I hope you've enjoyed this brief mini lesson on conflict, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say about it. So cheers and be well.